Hi, I'm Nick Shell, and if you're watching this video, which you probably are, it implies that you have watched me recently share my newest song with you called the Oregon Trail Generation. I make this video so that you can understand the inspiration behind why I wrote that song, and I will say immediately, Nate Bargatze, his Netflix special, what's it called, The Greatest American, something like that, that just came out, that largely solidified me writing this song. Things were already going in my head, you know. I turned 40 exactly a month ago. So this is a month into being 40. And after watching Nate Bargatze's stand-up on Netflix, his newest special, he talks about how there's this in-between generation. We're not Generation X, we're not millennials. We're that final generation that grew up where our parents didn't necessarily always knew where we were. We were just outside somewhere, but we always came back in time for dinner. We're that generation. We're the generation to where when we were leaving high school and entering college, and as far as like, for example, when my wife and I started dating, we had flip phones. I had a chocolate. That was the type of phone I had. And that was a brief time in history. It will never return. That's the generation we're part of. We're entering our 40s during what I'm saying in the song, the roaring 2020s. And it's not like we're a full generation, because I get it. Like, there are true millennials to come. Now, granted, I'm part millennial and part Generation X and part what's in between, this Oregon Trail generation. So let's go ahead and get into the lyrics of this song that I wrote called the Oregon Trail Generation. When we fell in love on flip phones. When we called each other, we had our very own ringtones. That's not quite the same as it is now. Like, pretty much I just keep my phone on vibrate, and my wife doesn't really call me. Like, no one really calls each other. You know, that's an outdated thing too, right? Everyone sends an instant message or a text, but the concept of calling people on the phone is pretty outdated at this point. I feel like the last generation who still knew what it was like to have a conversation over the phone because you couldn't just simply conveniently instant message someone. No, we're not millennials, nor Generation X, but the Oregon Trail is something we'll never forget. That's where we came from. That's what shaped us. And that's a very important line of the song, and that's ultimately why the Oregon Trail generation really sticks that phrase, because for us, we were of the last generation where we didn't grow up with a home computer in our home. Yes, home computers officially came out in 1983, but graduated high school in 99. So you can imagine, I never had a home computer growing up. Instead, every other Thursday in elementary school, you'd get to go to the computer lab and do math programs the whole time. And then at the very end, if you finished that, you could play the Oregon Trail or Dell Lake, some other game. But you hope for Oregon Trail. And if you're really lucky, you would not only get the Oregon Trail, you get it in color on one of the 2 color monitors, but you also make it all the way to the end where you get on the rafting part of the game. Very rare, but back then that was a big deal. We're part of that generation where that was really a symbol of who we were, that Oregon Trail. Because by the time we got to college, then okay, everyone's got a computer, but not growing up for us. So officially, I was born in '81, and this is arguably something like from like 1978 to 1985. If you were born in that range, you're probably, these things I'm talking about probably relate to you. And then here's the next part of the verse. So TGIF and Saturday morning cartoons, rented Nintendo games we played in our rooms, and now we enter our 40s in the roaring 2020s. So what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to make this song like too specific where it almost became cheesy. Like, I didn't want to specifically talk about Steve Urkel. Did I do that? I didn't want to put that in there. I didn't want to specifically talk about Super Mario Brothers or the Smurfs. I didn't want to be that specific, because I knew all I had to say is TGIF. That was, well, I guess that was what Full House, Perfect Strangers, Family Matters, whatever shows it was during that time, just the 10 of us that would show up on Friday night. And as a family, you'd watch those shows. And of course, Saturday morning cartoons, we're the final generation who grew up watching cartoons on a Saturday morning. Now you don't need to, because there's plenty of networks that have cartoons all the time. But for us, having cable, it was a big deal to be able to just watch nothing but cartoons on all the networks while you ate your sugar cereal. That was a big deal. And of course, rented Nintendo games we played in our rooms. Man, I feel like most weekends, at the end of the week, my mom would take us to the video store, or sometimes my dad would take me to the gas station. Yes, at the gas station. And you could rent a Nintendo game, and that was your weekend. I would go in my room. I'd be doing that all weekend. when I'd get a little bit cross-eyed from staring at the screen so much, I'd go outside and I'd ride my bike. But ultimately, that was my weekend. It was great. Renting Nintendo games we played in our rooms. It's funny because my kids, I was just telling my wife, they never play in their rooms. Our kids are not in their rooms. They sleep in their rooms and that's it. And the toys they have, they don't play with in there. Our kids don't have TVs in the rooms either. But either way, they're not really in their rooms other than sleeping. So even being in your own bedroom as a kid when you're not sleeping is almost a lost concept, I feel at this point. And then for the second verse, when we got home from school, our parents wouldn't know where we'd biked to. It was all about riding your bike. But we made it home for dinner, hamburger helper and Jell-O. Granted, I know those things still exist, but especially back then in the late 80s and early 90s, where processed foods and processed dinners were becoming more popular. And I had no complaints. I loved it. I loved having both of those things. My own kids don't like either of those things, but I liked both of those things there. So this is a song to celebrate the generation, those of us who are entering our 40s in what I'm calling the roaring 2020s. Because let's face it, a year and a half into this newest decade already, it's been a wild ride. And so, yeah, this is the roaring 2020s compared to 100 years ago in the 1920s. This is a different version of the roaring 2020s, but it's also interesting too, and as I've written songs about turning 40, how something no one tells you when you turn 40 is that you ultimately start focusing on what actually matters and you don't focus on what doesn't matter. And so it's been a good life, and it's been a good time to have grown up when I did, and I can look back with all this time in fondness. And I think a lot of people who can relate to when they hear the Oregon Trail generation, when they hear someone talking about the Oregon Trail computer game and TGIF and Saturday morning cartoons and these rented Nintendo, going to Blockbuster and renting a movie with your family and that being a big deal, hoping that the movie you wanted finally came out. Oh, Batman Returns is now out. Is it take? Oh, there's actually one available. Let's go. And calling the video store to see if they had it available. All of those things. Like, we're that generation in between, the Oregon Trail generation. So if you didn't get a chance to hear the song, I'll put a link right here so that you can check that out. But yeah, it's interesting. We were the final generation to do lots of things that our own kids could never grasp. I mean, it's funny to think that for us, when we hear our parents talk, everything that they were doing would have been basically in black and white. And now for my own kids, they're struggling to understand a world where there was no internet, where you couldn't look something up on a phone, where you had an actual phone in the kitchen and you'd have to dial, and if you had, you might even have a rotary, and you had to call people on a phone, and you could just look stuff up. You had to go to a library to check out books. I mean, it is amazing how much things have changed in my own 40 years. Your comments belong right here.